Chapter 35 The Other Side.
My name's Spike. It's nice to meet you. I'm Spike. Yes, I'm a dragon. Yes, I'm a weird-looking dragon. It's not really important right now, though. Don't worry about it. It's fine. Sup, dog? How's it chilling in yo foches? Yeah, those are words.
The long dragon sighed into the bathroom mirror again, still unsure exactly how to deal with what he was about to go through and who knew how long. Twilight had left a little while ago to go get the pony she'd be introducing him to today, and Spike had spent that time preparing himself for the upcoming encounter. The idea of speaking with other ponies hadn't been anything he had seriously entertained since he started his world-spanning adventure with Twilight, but the past couple of weeks had done something to alter that mindset of his as of late. Hearing about Twilight's interactions with the locals had piqued his curiosity, not to mention the time the two of them had spent with Fluttershy. He couldn't remember the last time a random stranger had been that nice to him or Twilight, but he wasn't going to complain about it. That alone was enough to get him curious about what the other people in this town were like. But right now, that curiosity was leading to a bout of nervousness. He remembered Twilight using the phrase, "butterflies in my stomach," before to describe the idea of being nervous about something, and he felt that was an appropriate analogy for what he was feeling. He knew nothing bad would happen, Twilight wouldn't let it, but he couldn't help feeling a little antsy about the whole thing all the same.
Oh, come on, you've talked to other ponies before,
he reassured himself, gazing deeply into his worried reflection.
Twilight's family, Cadence, Fluttershy, that's like 6 ponies right there.
That didn't help him feel much better about the upcoming meet and greet, but it did enough. He gave his reflection a pearly white, toothy grin, and knew that everything would be all right in the end. He didn't need to be stressing out over this. He was overthinking things. It was just a couple of Twilight's friends. Nothing could go wrong with that, right? Alas, that question was answered when Spike heard the door slam with incredible force, sending a shockwave through the entire house and causing Spike to nearly jump out of his scales. The thunderous crash brought a chilling sense of dread to the young reptile. In his relatively short life thus far, he had never known the slamming of a door to be anything good. It usually meant that someone was angry.
No.
Twilight soon shouted from the other room, followed by a few muffled stomps of her hooves. The distressed tone in her voice cemented it in Spike's mind that something had gone wrong.
Of course. Why not? Oh boy, this can't be good.
Spike couldn't remember the last time Twilight had sounded this angry about something. Slowly but surely, he slinked his way out of the bathroom and towards the living room. He wasn't sure what was going on, but his curiosity and concern for Twilight outweighed his trepidation. When he arrived at the scene, there were a few things that he noticed straight away. First, he saw the dusty old cape that Twilight always wore to keep her wings hidden off in a far corner of the room, with a few more black patches than he remembered. He had long since learned what fire damage looked like, and the cloak had definitely suffered some, though not anything too severe. He didn't know why Twilight's cape would be fire damaged, but it did add to the dread welling up in his mind. The next thing that stuck out to him was the lack of anyone else. It was just him and Twilight, alone in the temporary home, the latter of which was busy glaring daggers at the calendar with an intensity that Spike had rarely seen of her. He found himself comparing her present state to distant and hazy memories of Twilight's school days, how she would spend hours on end glaring like this at whatever books or papers her teachers had thrown at her. Spike winced at those recollections, distinctly remembering just what the Alicorn had gone through during her time in Celestia's torture chamber of a school. Or, well, Spike had always assumed it was torture, given how much he had watched his closest friend suffer through it. Though these familiar feelings were dashed away in the instant a blot of light leapt off Twilight's horn and reduced the calendar to ash. Spike could barely remember the last time he had seen Twilight lash out like that, and he wasn't sure if she had ever acted like this in the past. If she had, he either hadn't seen it, or it was so long ago that he just didn't remember it. Regardless, he shuddered at the Alicorn's sudden display of violence. He knew Twilight would never hurt him. More of a reflex than a logical reaction, but even still, it wasn't an easy thing to watch. Something was very wrong. So much so that he was compelled to move forward, albeit with a meek hesitance, knowing that he had to do something about it. For as long as he could remember, Spike had been a source of comfort for Twilight. For one reason or another, his presence had an almost healing effect on Twilight and her mental state, and she was the same for him. And in times such as these, Twilight had learned to view it as his duty to help ease Twilight through troubling times, even if he seldom knew what was wrong or how to fix it. All he could do was be there and try.
Twilight?
He asked meekly, earning the Alicorn's immediate attention with an unnerving jerking motion. Her eyes were cold and hollow, devoid of anything other than anger. It was enough to make Spike briefly question his decision and self-appointed role, but it was only a moment before it continued.
Did you talk to them?
That question might not have been the best one to start with, but it was the only thing Spike could think of. If her attitude is to be believed, the talk with those ponies most definitely did not go according to plan. And that question would more than certainly get Twilight to talk about it. Well, or so he hoped. But Twilight didn't say a single word in reply, at least not at first. She just stood there with that same dark grimace for a few seconds, before another emotion began to make itself known. One that Spike, unfortunately, recognized immediately. Guilt. It looked like Twilight was feeling an immense wave of regret over something. But it only lasted for a second before she came back to being bitterly stoic.
It didn't work out,
Twilight answered snappily, her gaze falling back to where the calendar used to be.
Go get your things. We're leaving. Today.
The answer, and the cold way in which Twilight had given it, caught Spike off guard. He didn't like the sound of that, and his priority shifted from trying to help Twilight towards figuring out what was going on. Things must have been worse than he thought.
What do you mean we're leaving?
That was the first of many questions that came to Spike's mind. With each second, he felt more and more like he was back in the woods, being chased by those Timberwolf monsters. Or like back when he was in that cave with that red dragon. He was scared and confused, his mouth moving before his head could and continuing to spout out questions.
What about the stuff you were dealing with? What about Fluttershy? Rainbow Dash can take care of it. It's her job.
Twilight walked away without even looking at him, hastily rummaging through drawers in search of something.
Now hurry up, we don't have time. But what about...
He was abruptly cut short the instant he saw Twilight spin around towards him.
No!
Spike hadn't been expecting Twilight to yell at him like that. The fire in her eyes burned hotter than any meager flame he could produce. And just as quickly as she had lashed out, she was back to rummaging through the drawers and cabinets. No backpedaling, no apology, just a burst of rage followed by cold indifference. It was harrowing, and Spike could do nothing but scuttle back to his room in the hopes that he wouldn't set her off again. He slipped inside and shut the door behind him, as if the Alicorn would be stopped by a simple wooden door. With wide eyes glued onto the floor, Spike stood there, holding the door shut for almost an unnecessary amount of time. He could barely breathe, and what ones he managed to take were short and hurried. A claw found its way from the door to his chest, his heart pounding like a tribal drum from what he had just been through.
Did that really just happen?
The question looped over and over in his head, unable to really process what had just happened. Never before had Twilight directed that kind of anger towards him. Maybe once or twice at other people who deserved it, but never at him. She had never once spoken to him like this.
That didn't happen. It didn't happen. It didn't happen.
He'd never felt this helpless and small before. He couldn't stop shaking, practically on the verge of tears from that short-lived discussion. He still didn't get what was going on, but even in this uneasy state, he could decipher that it must have been very bad. If it was enough to get Twilight to explode at him like this, yeah, this wayward thought was enough to get him to start getting his things together so they could leave. Not that he had many things. Just a few toys and books that Twilight had accrued for him over their travels. Aside from the book about dragons that he had long since sworn off, he had a couple of other texts on basic reading and mathematics skills. And for the scholar, Twilight wasn't even willing to travel the world in search of long dragons without stopping to educate Spike. The toys were another story, just a few trinkets and baubles for him to fidget with whenever boredom struck. They weren't anything special. A ball or two, a chess set, a stuffed goat, and a few puzzle boxes and other similar items. Just simple things to keep him entertained from time to time. Spike didn't bother to wax romantic about his belongings. He was too busy gathering them up into a neat little pile on the ground for when Twilight came around to collect him. It was the best he could do without having the saddlebags, but he wasn't about to go out there just to grab them. He already made Twilight mad enough, and that fire certainly didn't need any more fuel. But that sentiment was thrown right out the window as another thunderous crash echoed throughout the house, followed almost immediately by a series of unfamiliar voices shouting out one by one.
Twilight! Mr. Knox got arrested! Do you know what happened? What did... Pinkie, you can't just barge into other people's houses like that. It's not...
Spike could have sworn he felt his heart stop for a moment with this sudden development. Intruders had made their way into his and Twilight's home without any difficulty, something that was only made worse in his mind as he remembered Twilight telling him that her talk with the others hadn't gone well. Were they here to do something about the dragon that had been hiding in their town? That was the only answer he could come up with, even if what they were saying didn't really match with that idea. Either way, Spike was compelled to leave the relative safety of his bedroom to see what was going on. Outraged or not, the safest place was as close to Twilight as he could physically be.
You're an owl?
Twilight's magic suddenly surged through the whole house, every physical surface glowing with a familiar magenta hue. The light's purpose was made painfully clear with the clicking of nearby locks, doors, and windows, sending a brand new wave of distress through Spike's already alarmed mind.
Hey!
He blared out, frantically working the door handle to try and get out of his newly made prison. But his efforts were in vain, or they were, until he remembered that the door locked from the inside. He couldn't help but feel a little dumb as he looked down towards the simple latch that stood between him and freedom, and wasted no time in unlocking the barricade.
Quiet!
Both of you!
Twilight's voice stopped the dragon in his tracks, just as he opened the door a crack, effortlessly convincing him to stop and listen.
Sorry, just don't make a scene. Please.
His equine caretaker didn't sound anywhere near as angry as she had a bit ago. She was giving off a meek tone of distress. What in the world was going on out there?
You're an alicorn!
The first intruder answered at the absolute perfect time, catching Spike's full attention.
Why are you an alicorn?
This was bad. On top of everything else, now Twilight's being an alicorn was out in the open? Oh, if she was angry before, Spike didn't even want to think about what was going through her head now. For reasons he had never fully understood, Twilight did everything in her power to keep that part of her a secret from everyone outside of a select few. From what he did know, alicorns were exceptionally rare. He had only ever heard of there being 2 or 3 others in the whole world. So, in his mind, it made sense why Twilight would keep that a secret from the masses. He could scarcely imagine the wrath that was born from this secret being exposed. But much to his shock, that divine fury never came. As he silently listened to the conversation, he was surprised by just how calm Twilight was acting with these complete strangers, especially after how she had exploded at him not even a few minutes ago. And with a few simple words from one of the interlopers, Twilight's anger was drowned out by apparent sorrow, as the conversation took on a quieter tone. Spike ventured further out, keeping himself low to the ground so as not to be so easily spotted. Yet once again, his advances were cut short by a simple sentence.
Alicorns aren't born. They're made. Made by the Queen. The only one who can anymore.
Made by the Queen? Spike asked himself, not knowing what the stranger was talking about. Spike knew for a fact that Queen Celestia wasn't Twilight's mother, so the statement made very little sense to him. Nothing about this situation made sense.
Don't remind me,
Twilight hoarsely murmured back.
Okay. Well, why don't you just tell her you don't want to be an alicorn anymore?
The first invader seemed almost giddy about that suggestion.
We were talking about it earlier, remember? It's reversible. And she's going to be in town for the festival. I could even sneak you into the... Do you think I already tried that?
And with that, Twilight's anger was back, making Spike wince.
I've been like this for 6 years. That was the first thing I thought of. And it won't work. Not for me.
Just as quickly as it had flared up, her anger died back down into a weary drawl.
The spell is absolute. Undoing it would put me right back where I was before she cast it. Just like Poesia. She's right back to where she was before the spell was cast. So you'd be 6 years younger? I can imagine how that would be a setback, but if being an alicorn upsets you this much, then growing up again shouldn't be that big of a deal. I wouldn't even get the chance.
What in the world were they talking about? That question tormented Spike, his young mind barely able to follow the conversation. Alicorns being made, Twilight not being able to go back, none of it made any sense. It was driving him mad. So much that he wanted to just leap out and ask Twilight what she was going on about. But then, as if to answer his silent pleas, Twilight began to try and explain everything. And as she did, there were a few parts of her tale that stuck out, especially in Spike's mind.
6 years ago. Stupid egg. Killed me.
Spike may not have been fully following what was going on up until now, but this brief story definitely put a few things into perspective. His memories from that long ago were hazy at best, but he did know that he came from an egg, and that he had hatched 6 years ago, right around the time that this event in Twilight's life took place. Anyone could have put the pieces together, and an overwhelming sense of guilt came over him as he put them together. A claw moved of its own accord to cover his snout, keeping his mouth shut in a vice grip to keep him from screaming.
I killed Twilight?
Part of him fought back to deny this outrageous claim. There was a lot he didn't know about the world, but he knew that when something died, it didn't keep going. And Twilight had certainly been going for the past 6 years, even if she seemed fully convinced otherwise. A forced smile came to his sealed lips as he convinced himself of this. But the dream was shattered when the first interloper spoke up again.
So you actually died? Yeah. I'd be in some grave right now if Celestia didn't step in when she did.
Twilight's words cemented it in Spike's mind that she was only speaking the truth. And it hurt him. It hurt him more than he thought he ever could hurt. Knowing that his very existence only came about because of Twilight's suffering. That he was the cause of that suffering. It was heart-wrenching. But at least he wasn't the only one going through turmoil. Evidenced as Twilight continued to rant and rave, volatile streams of magic started to be flung this way and that as her wrath reached its apex. Before the furious alicorn fell to her flanks and just started to cry, going on and on about how it wasn't fair. Spike could only agree. Nothing else was said from that point. At least not anything that Spike cared about. It was around now that Twilight let the intruders leave without any fuss. She made her way to what was left of the couch, sitting amidst the sorrowful sofa shreds. Spike, meanwhile, held his position in the hallway, practically on the verge of tears himself. Twilight's testimony had a truly damaging effect on him. He didn't know if he'd ever even recover from it. The fact that Twilight had just admitted to all of this pain she had endured since Spike's birth, pain that he couldn't help but feel responsible for, despite her consistent claims that Celestia was the one at fault. Because of him, in Twilight's own words, she had to choose between dying another horrible death or living forever. To watch everyone else turn to dust around her until she was all alone. Those words in particular stuck out to Spike in retrospect, even in his dismayed state. Twilight seemed utterly convinced that she would one day end up alone. That at some point, she would be on her own, with nobody else. And while it might have been selfish of him to think of this right now, he wondered when this would apply even to him. In fact, now that he was thinking about it, another question came to mind. If Spike had been the catalyst for all of this, why in the world did she want anything to do with him? She had shown him nothing but love and compassion for as long as he could remember, minus a few lectures on behavior and etiquette here and there. She had even gone so far as to say that he meant everything to her. It didn't make any sense. How could these two truths coexist? Spike's existence took Twilight's life away. Yet she loved him with all of her heart. So much that she offered to leave her home behind to help him find other long dragons. And then it all came crashing down. The realization cutting deep. His silent whimpering stopped, and he stood back up, blankly staring ahead, as an expression of mixed pain and revelation came onto his face. He didn't like it, but he had answered his own question.
She's trying to get rid of me.
As the conclusion came to mind, the intense guilt he felt for what he unintentionally did was joined by a sharp sense of betrayal.
This whole time, she's just been trying to ditch me. That's why she wanted to find long dragons. It has to be.
There wasn't a doubt in his mind at this point. He was convinced that this was all some elaborate ruse to get rid of him. All these years of love and learning that had shaped him into who he was, what did they even mean to her? Was it all just a means to an end? After all, what did she have to lose? She had all the time in the world. That much had just been made clear.
Twilight.
A bitter snort escaped from him as he marched into the living room, bitterly glaring at the alicorn with nothing but disdain.
Spike!
Twilight flinched at his arrival, a wide-eyed look of surprise on her face. She sat there on her throne of scraps, eyes red and puffy from her still ongoing display of tears.
How much of that did you hear? Oh, enough.
Spike's tone was as venomous as his anger.
Enough to know the truth.
Twilight's shame was easy enough to spot, her eyes loosely narrowing as she hung her head.
I'm sorry. You really should be. Were you ever going to fess up about it? I don't know.
Her voice carried weakly across the room, seeming to Spike as if she were fishing for his pity in this scenario.
It's not an easy thing to talk about. Seemed pretty easy when you were talking to those two.
Spike scoffed, much to Twilight's apparent surprise.
But then again, they're not the stupid egg that ruined your life, are they?
A hurt-filled look was quickly turned Spike's way. Not that he cared much at the moment.
Spike! That's not what I meant! Shut up! I'm done with your lies!
Spike roared back, searing tongues of emerald flame bursting out of his mouth to emphasize his words.
You've been lying to me my whole life! And I'm done with it! Spike!
The tears that had been rolling down Twilight's face were coming harder and faster now. Evidently, she was caught off guard by Twilight's change in character. She stayed quiet for an almost unbearably long time, likely trying to come up with some new lie to worm her way out of this, Spike couldn't help but think.
Where did this come from? What did I do wrong?
Spike couldn't answer that question. Not at first, at the very least. In spite of his rage, he still couldn't help but look back on all of the time she had been there for him. All the laughs they'd shared, and the tears, and the lazy days where nothing happened. Seeing Twilight hurting like this was so painful for him, even with his anger. Doubly so knowing that he was the one who was causing it. But his temper was burning far too brightly to be doused by a few wayward tears. In his irrational state, he wasn't even sure if they were sincere, or just another of the lies he was accusing Twilight of spewing. And that uncertainty only served to make him angrier.
You made me love you.
Spike snarled through gritted fangs, beginning to tremble as every muscle tensed up. He could feel himself starting to cry just as his conflicting emotions raged for dominance.
Just so you could ditch me and hurt me like I hurt you.
Twilight didn't say anything in her defense, a signal to Spike that he was on the correct path in his persecutions. She stood there shaking almost as much as he was, tiny gasps and whimpers occasionally slipping through her mouth. In any other situation, Spike would be the first to run forwards with open arms to try and help her through this. But not this time. He was far too gone in his wrath. He was convinced that this had all been some trick on her part, some ploy to get him to stop asking questions and accept the status quo she had established for him. Some part of him still believed that Twilight was being sincere, but another, louder part was quick to retort, claiming that she was just that good at lying.
Well, mission accomplished.
Spike continued in a low growl, doing everything he could to maintain his furious persona.
You got what you wanted. Here, I'll even save you the trouble of ditching me.
Nothing else was said as he turned his back on his former caretaker and strode for the door. He didn't know where he was going to go or what he was going to do, but he didn't care right now. All he wanted was to get away and not see Twilight again. But that plan was cut short when a familiar magenta glow surrounded him, and a firm but gentle pulling sensation drew him back towards her.
Spike, don't!
Twilight commanded as sternly as her tears and her agony would allow.
You have it all wrong. Just let me
shut up! Spike bellowed as he dug his claws into the wooden floor, the natural weapons grinding loudly against the hardwood surface before he was able to halt his backward momentum.
Just let go so you can be rid of me already!
With great strain, he began to move forward against the alicorn's magical pull. She tried pulling harder, Spike could tell, but even still, he kept going.
Spike, stop! Just let me talk!
Twilight tugged even harder with her magic, though not nearly enough to cause any kind of harm. Spike groaned as he kept fighting the arcane pull, a losing battle at this point. She wasn't going to let up anytime soon, and he knew that she could easily end this charade if she wanted to. He knew enough about alicorns, Twilight in particular, to know that she wasn't even putting in a fraction of her full might right now. It was almost insulting. Like she wasn't even really trying to stop him from leaving. That only made him angrier, making him fight even harder against her magic. An unpleasant numbness began to spread through his body as his fury grew, boiling over entirely into a seething foam of unbridled wrath. At this point, there were no rational thoughts in Spike's head. He had been completely consumed in emotion, barely more than a wild beast. Not unlike the red dragon that had chased the two into Ponyville in the first place. And it was in this state of irrational, frenzied rage that Spike made his move.
I hate you!
He spun around without a moment's hesitation and lunged at Twilight, using her own magic to speed him up. Through his own furious hissing, he heard Twilight gasp in shock, before yelping in pain as he sunk in his teeth as deep as he could get them. He kept himself latched there for what felt like eons, breathing heavily as the gushing warmth filled his maw, the pounding heartbeat in his ears overriding everything else. And then he realized what he had just done. With a loud, shocked gasp, he pulled away from Twilight as quickly as he could, the bitter taste of blood still in his mouth. It was only now that his clarity came back to him, and all of his unfounded wrath and rage was replaced with fear and regret. Internally, he acknowledged that he didn't really hate Twilight. He didn't believe any of the horrible things he just said and thought. He just let his own anger run away with him. And now he had to pay the price. He scurried back, shaking his head rapidly as if to deny the evidence of his crime standing in front of him. Twilight didn't say anything. She just stood there with a look of abstract horror on her face as she stared down at what Spike had just done to her. Her right foreleg was held slightly aloft, a gaping bite wound marring its once pristine fur. Blood trickled from the freshly delivered wound, just as it did from Spike's now crimson-colored maw. Neither of them knew how long they stayed like this, both staring at the results of what he had done. It was Twilight who finally broke the silence.
You bit me.
She didn't sound angry at all. That was the worst part about this. The only thing Spike could parse from her tone was surprise and disappointment. She didn't even bother to look up from what he had done. Without another word, Spike ran as fast as he could, not even bothering to acknowledge as Twilight called out for him. He ran back to the only safe place he could think of, his bedroom. He wormed his way inside and slammed the door shut behind him, fumbling with the lock for a few seconds before getting it to click in place. He knew it wouldn't stop Twilight, but it didn't stop him from at least trying to buy himself some time. It was now, in the isolation of his bedroom, that Spike allowed himself to weep. He paced back and forth about the room, sobbing and sniffling, unable to process the reality of his new situation with Twilight.
Why'd I do that? Why'd I do that? Why did I do that?
He demanded of himself in a shouted whisper, over and over again without any sign of stopping. With every second, his sobs grew louder and louder, and a newfound hatred for himself grew more and more. At this point, he couldn't even remember the feelings of unjustified anger and hatred he had aimed at Twilight over a few hasty assumptions. And that's what they were, he realized. Hasty assumptions that he had made of Twilight's character in a moment of weakness. He knew that she loved him with all her heart. She wouldn't have given him a single year of her life if she didn't, let alone 6. And how had he repaid that? By brutally tearing into her flesh right after screaming horrible things at her. Because he let his anger get the better of him. He could still taste the blood on his tongue. He could feel it dripping from his chin. He began to cough and gag to get the horrible taste out of his mouth, trying to wipe away the red smears on his face with his claws. But it did nothing. He could still feel that bitter, warm taste dancing in his mouth, and now even his claws were dyed crimson, as if to remind him of his crime. He had fallen into an incoherent, murmuring mess at this point, once again unable to form any reasonable, rational thought. But instead of rage clouding his mind, it was self-loathing and regret that kept him from thinking with any kind of logic. And it was in this sorry state that he made his next hasty decision, his eyes glancing up towards the room's only window.
She didn't hate me before. She has to hate me now.
He murmured to himself as he skittishly approached the room's only other exit. He didn't know what Twilight was going to do next in response to what he had done. But he did know that he could no longer bring himself to face her. Not after everything he had just accused her of. And certainly not after attacking her like that. And so, still shaking from the experience he had just gone through, he unlocked and opened the window, hesitating for just a moment as he looked to the outside world. Three knocks on the door halted any further progress he would make, shortly followed by Twilight's haunting voice.
Spike?
She meekly called from behind the wooden barrier, the only thing standing between her and Spike.
Can I come in? I just want to talk.
Spike could practically feel the tears rolling on her face, and he could hear the quivering of her lip as she choked the words out. She was hurting, that much was obvious. And it was far more than the physical pain caused by her injury. That bite was so much more powerful than just a flesh wound. And it must have sent a very nerve-wracking message to the one he had given it to. But even still, he couldn't bring himself to turn back to the door. He just couldn't. So, with a heavy heart, Spike moved as silently as he could and slinked out of the window down to the soft grass below. It wasn't a long fall, but he wouldn't be able to crawl back in without Twilight's help. There was no going back now, and for as much as it hurt him to do it, he went on his way. He didn't know where he would go from here. He just knew that he had to go.
Spike!
Twilight's shrill scream echoing through the open window caused him to hesitate for a single second before he took off running, managing to get away long before Twilight had the chance to see his shameful escape through the window.